Good afternoon and welcome to this week's edition of Halftime Talk. I'm delighted to be joined by Trisha Curtis, President and CEO of nothing other than PetroNerds. I feel like one of those quite often. Trisha, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. And I like the enthusiasm with the name. That's great.
Yes. Well, it's, I've had a few different name experiences in the last, PetroNerds is obviously has its own resonance, but I was doing an interview with somebody last week whose job title was Chief Failure Officer. So there's all sorts of everything these days, and why not? Trisha, I mean, there's so many different ways to come at the angles of this energy markets, oil and gas markets, and certainly volatility is a big one. Let's sort of put a big kind of parameter or sort of a headline to our conversation. We're going to see where demand destruction versus supply concerns. Let's start right next door to you, where there seems to be lots of potential supply. America racing back to being the world's largest oil and maybe even gas producer. What is the outlook on the doorstep in the US on the supply side to be the provider of all things the world needs right now?
You know, I think it's very positive. You guys obviously see the rig count and you see the activity that's going on in the US. We have significant tightness in the market in terms of getting rigs, getting frac fleets. We're hitting basically almost to our rig count levels pre-COVID, but the U.S. we are the largest oil and natural gas producer in the world now, even with declines that we had since 2019. So I think production had declined on a monthly basis, just 11 million barrels a day and change in January. We're going to see that number come way, way up. I know the EIA and a number of other forecasts have set monthly increases, but you can't have this many rigs and this many holes being poked into the ground without the production eventually coming on. So we're seeing that. You're going to see.
I mean, the general narrative where I am out in the Middle East is like, why aren't the Americans pumping more? They love to make money. They're incredibly capable and the best technology, and it would appear in this just year of recovery that U.S. energy industry hasn't really ridden the wave yet. Is that fair?
There's a couple answers for that and reasons for that. And largely, I always attribute it to a couple things that simply is the public-private split. So the public companies versus the private companies. And we have seen the private companies are drilling like crazy. They're really ramping up their activity. And it's taken a little longer for the public guys to come into this, even with high oil prices. And part of that is massive investor pressure, coupled with this very intense ESG and regulatory pressure from the White House and the administration that's really put the administration is not a fan of oil and gas, and it's clouded a lot of the outlook. I mean, from day one of the climate change executive order that I think, and the worries from the Security Exchange Commission, the SEC with Scope 1, Scope 2, and even the mention of Scope 3 emissions. So I think the public space is a lot harder. I mean, obviously with these prices, we have the signaling, and it's mixed right now of the administration saying, hey, we're going to export more LNG to Europe. Well, that's great, but you're going to need to build a pipeline out of the Marcellus Shale in the northeast of the U.S. You're going to have to build a pipeline at some point because we're nearing that capacity. But we're producing gross withdrawals of U.S. gas production. A couple months ago, we're 120 BCF a day. So that is, we're producing gas with a very low gas rig count because we have a lot of natural gas, and these older wells are producing more gas up in the Williston Basin and all across the country. So we have a massive amount of potential. I mean, if we want to increase gas production, that's not a problem, but you do have to have the infrastructure and the pipelines. And when you have this pressure on the public space and just uncertainty, I would say uncertainty is not good for business in any kind of business, and in oil and gas, it's definitely one of those. So if you look at the rig count now, it's very much close to where we were on sort of a pre-COVID level. So if you're looking at this from abroad and you're looking at the US, it's quite busy in the field. If you're going to Midland or you're going to anywhere in Texas, I mean, things are heating up.
Do you think the industry is going to have to change its narrative about Biden is bad for oil and gas? He seems to be like your biggest salesman. He's out in the world saying, buy our gas, buy our oil. In a sense, the circumstances have obviously changed, but nonetheless, it does appear that the industry couldn't be in a better place. Record profits, can produce and pump as much as you can. The question ultimately for us in the big bad world is, as we started out the conversation, clearly America, big, massive oil and gas producer. The question is, how big of an exporter will they become? And obviously that's growing, it would appear, quite significantly. What's your outlook for that? And that's really from the point of view of the European disruption now, heavily dependent on Russia, can't do much with this Ukraine conflict, very weak as a result. Is the posse coming over the hill? Is the cavalry going to come and save Europe on the gas side?
Well, like I said, from a production potential, that's not a problem. We could do that now. And I think, Biden has said that we'll export an additional 15 billion cubic meters this year, and we'll export, a 30 billion or a 50 billion cubic meters by 2030. And basically that's over 1.5 BCF a day we're going to increase by the end of the year. And by 2030, it's like just shy of, I think, about 5 BCF a day. That's possible, but you have to have the export capacity. And up until very, very recently, this administration was sitting on LNG export facility permits. So they were not approving them, and they were doing that on the basis saying the market doesn't need it. So this administration, I still contend that they're not clear on their stance on crude oil, natural gas, and coal, because they don't like this stuff. And so they're in a very difficult position, and you have to do more than just say we're going to export it. You have to actually facilitate it and do that. So yes, the US can, and we're going to have midterm elections, and there's lots of volatility and risk in the political space. So lots of things going on there. I think ultimately from a technical standpoint, the US can, I would say, be the cavalry in terms of a natural gas standpoint. That's possible. And it would certainly just help the market in terms of any additional volumes we can get onto the LNG spot market are going to be helpful in tampering down gas prices. And we've already seen that. I mean, when Biden announced that we were going to do these exports, gas prices stumbled. We're seeing very high natural gas prices, though, in the US at the levels that should make people concerned, because obviously they're impacting heating people's homes, doing all kinds of, electricity, everything. And that's really, one, it makes coal a little more, if coal is cheaper, people are going to pivot to coal. And two, we're just sort of looking at these 2007, 2008 levels, which get people a little, get me as an economist, quite anxious when I start seeing these things. But absolutely, from a technical standpoint, we can export the gas. We could be there. And from a crude oil standpoint, we're exporting over 3 million barrels per day. The more we produce, and the more we're able to export, and as long as it's finding a home, it's there. We've seen.
How does that work vis-a-vis American demand? Because obviously you're also a net importer.
Absolutely. It's really those light sweet, but because U.S. shale produces so much light sweet crude and such higher API gravity, and a lot of those refineries on the Gulf Coast are very well suited for heavier crude. Used to be Mexican and Venezuelan crude. Now it takes in, our biggest importer is from Canada. So, if the US and Canada wanted to be energy independent, we could do that with literally a single pipeline, and we wouldn't be importing anything. But that just hasn't been approved. That Keystone XL has not been approved. So we're getting several million barrels a day from Canada. That's heavy crude that goes into the Gulf Coast, and that's where you have coking capacity and where you're refining this stuff. So the light sweet crude is when we allowed for export several years ago. That light sweet crude is what goes into the market, and it's great. It has displaced a lot of, I would say, Nigerian crude and elsewhere. And when the market's oversupplied, certainly it's competing with light sweet barrels from Africa and the Middle East as well. But it is that lighter, sweeter stuff. It works great in less complex refineries in Europe, for example, and other places. From a refinery standpoint, that's probably a deeper discussion, but yeah, a few million barrels a day, largely light sweet crude, a lot of it coming from the Permian Basin, the Eagle Ford, and even some from the Williston Basin as well.
If we flip across the Atlantic on the supply side to Russia, which of course is the big supply concern story, that hasn't really translated yet. The supply keeps coming to the market. The Europeans, of course, caught between a rock and a hard place, politically want to cut them off, but obviously economically can't afford to because the substitute isn't there. How do you see that playing out going forward?
Yeah, I think I'm glad that you pointed out, because I think the market had really been too quick to think that these barrels were going to come off. I did not think that they were. I did think the invasion would take place. I didn't think the barrels would leave the market, but I did think that the market would spike as it did. And we saw, that spike to 140 Brent and came down. And so much of that was fear driven algorithmic trading. And I would say even now, $20 to $25 of price in crude oil prices are really geopolitical fear driven and less about supply and demand fundamentals. And so when you see testing in Beijing and you see worries on China and prices slipping and now we're 95 WTI today, I mean, this is really a lot of algorithmic trading going on. So Russia was producing the 11 million barrels per day and change. I would say production is something that, if your country is at war and you're focusing all your efforts on that, we should be thinking about, how sustainable is that 11 million barrels a day and change. Pre-war, I was not concerned about them going to 12 million barrels a day and holding it for quite some time with ease. So, but now that there's a war going on, that's a little questionable. But like you said, those barrels are moving. I mean, over 4 million barrels a day of crude were being exported with product. That's about 7 million barrels a day in total. And the fear was that, it wasn't moving around. And I think there was a couple weeks where it was dislocated and the market was messy. But certainly we've seen countries like China, like India, buying these severely discounted barrels. We're talking $20 or $30 off crude oil prices. So, China isn't getting enough attention in terms of, we keep talking about Europe buying these barrels, but China's getting a severe discount to their crude. They're buying their grain, they're buying their coal, they're buying their everything. And they are absolutely front loading the bill for a lot of this war.
Well, it's certainly a good time if you're getting access to those discounted barrels. That supply piece may not be now such a drama as we've been anticipating, because on the flip side of the coin, it's all about where is demand. And there was a period in which robust demand, 100 million barrels a day, 2019 kind of global demand levels were coming back this year. Now there is demand concerns sprouting up everywhere, including on your doorstep. But let's go to the biggest source of demand concern right now, which is the biggest surprise perhaps, and that's China. How are you reading the situation in China, where clearly they're contending with the sort of COVID Omicron wave that we all dealt with sort of 3 months ago?
Yeah, I think it's less of a surprise. And I think for folks that really follow China, it's not a surprise because they have a lot of wonky policy and various strategies going on. And from a global economic growth standpoint, I'm very glad you bring it up, because I think folks are not really paying attention to, should have been paying attention to inflation a year ago, a full year ago, and realizing that inflation and high prices and high oil prices together really can impact oil itself, or impact oil demand. And so we don't have any bright spots in the global economy for global economic growth. And China is relatively opaque, and people aren't focusing on it the way they should. So we're focusing on it now, and we hear that Beijing is doing these mass testing and may have these lockdowns that we're seeing in Shanghai. I mean, these are really intense lockdowns. These are lockdowns that we're seeing people, barricades putting up, people stuck in their homes, people being welded into their homes, families being torn apart, elderly people being pulled away from their homes and put in quarantine facilities. Very, very serious stuff that, is sort of talked about on Bloomberg and CNBC in the market, but not really given a lot of really appreciation for how serious this is and the reasoning behind it. So they're obviously sticking with the zero COVID strategy, which is politically what they started with. And so there's some reasoning behind that. But if this is really about the elderly and protecting them, but they're the ones that seem to be dying in the quarantine facilities and dying without food, it's a lot of mess.
They have real vaccine problems in the terms of numbers. But just digging a little bit deeper there, as you're pointing out, we had commentary on our podcast in January, well before this drama evolved, that was about talking about China peak oil demand, and that there's these structural weaknesses that have appeared in China long before this particular wave of COVID, with the construction, the real estate crisis last year, which clearly hasn't gone away. When you think about those deeper crevices in the China demand picture, i.e. economic growth and development, obviously we're down to 5 or 4% growth this year. Your thoughts on those structural weaknesses on that longer term demand outlook?
Absolutely. And that I think that 4% GDP target, or the 5.5% GDP target that they had, I mean, the numbers that we're seeing come out, I mean, these structural issues have been going on for quite some time. I mean, the property sector is nearly a third of their economy. And even if it flatlined and just maintained, which it's obviously not doing, it's coming down off a cliff, that would pull down the global economy and pull down global oil demand. And you don't get a lot of transparency within China, because we see sort of these imports, right? We see imports of 10 to 12 million barrels per day of crude oil imports. We know that they produce 4.5 million barrels a day of crude. So, I mean, given their shutdowns, they're clearly not using all that, but we're not going to see, we don't have the transparency in the data. That's why demand data is always kind of this look back, and we have to be very careful of looking at this China data. They can obviously store it, but very, very serious issues from a demand growth perspective. It's not going to come from China. I mean, they're just not going to be ramping up demand growth for crude oil, simply because their economy is not going to be demanding it. Now, they can try, they may be desperate and really ratchet up an infrastructure boom after this, they sort of get out of this COVID thing and realize that, economic growth is backsliding, and who knows what they're planning for stuff regionally with what they're doing. I mean, there's reasons they could be demanding more crude oil, but in terms of a pure economic growth standpoint and the health of their economy, it's poor. And I mean, most people know that the GDP data that just came out last week or a couple weeks ago, it didn't actually match up either. I mean, most people know that's been massaged, and if they're positive GDP growth, that's probably a big feat right now in itself. But the construction data, the unemployment data, we're seeing rising unemployment, obviously with these shutdowns. That unemployment data does not actually include rural unemployment. So you got hundreds of millions of people that aren't being even accounted for with their Hoku system and how they do the rural urban look at their country. So it's very complex, and I would say overall the medium and long-term outlook, I think, is quite poor.
And when you think that OPEC, and these obviously where we're sitting in the Middle East, they've bet their whole house on China delivering that marginal demand barrel they have, obviously, for the last 20 years, but in a lot of ways it feels like that party is over. The other demand destruction concerns is ultimately all things inflation. And we saw last week the IMF downgrading global economic growth, and it's a continuous revision downward. The outlook now is sitting on your doorstep. In the next week, the Fed are going to very likely to increase rates by 50 basis points, the beginning of a much more robust tightening cycle. What does that mean for the outlook for the US economy, the engine of the world, and US energy demand, do you think?
I think, we saw obviously the market get spooked by those. We know that the Fed's going to have to be aggressive, but the Fed has not been aggressive. So a 0.50, even a 50 basis point hike isn't enough to curb 8.5% inflation right now. And we know inflation is going to ratchet up. So we're looking at 10% inflation and high oil prices and high everything prices, which is very damning to the economy. And I think we've had these lagging indicators of, well, the US consumer is okay, and everybody still wants a house. And I think that data is starting to wane. We're well north of 5% on mortgage rates. And so we're starting to see these real pains that are going to be very serious, and they're going to translate into oil demand. And the US oil demand is roughly a 20 million barrel a day, product market. So that softens. I mean, if you look at the 2008 crisis, I mean, that softened considerably when we had a big recession. And it's this, I've been talking about recession for over a year, and people say, "Oh, no recession," but now you're starting to hear about it more and more. Obviously, and when I'm watching, Middle East Open and everything, you're starting to hear about this more and more. I think these rate hikes obviously they make the dollar look a little better. So we're fears in China right now. Dollar looks hot, and so that actually has a negative impact on oil. So that's partly what's moving oil prices right now. But I think overwhelmingly, I don't think the market has caught up to what you just explained very well. These lowering economic forecasts globally, the fact that we don't have economic growth globally, the fact that inflation's everywhere, and this ultimately eats into, I don't think oil demand is going to crash, but it ultimately eats into oil demand growth and that trajectory. And like you said, we have a roughly 100 million barrel day demand market. The US is 20 million barrels a day of that. And so if you slip by just a little bit, a few 100,000 barrels a day here, a few 100,000 a day there, that impacts the market. And that's something that, OPEC has historically, they're great at supply. They're not historically really great at managing, these deeper nuanced levels of demand.
I think if we didn't have the Ukraine crisis, of course, is a big if we didn't, but you know, how low would oil prices be right now? And because it does feel like the natural tendency, anytime sort of Ukraine drifts into this sort of neutral nightmare, but not getting any worse, not getting any better, seems the oil price wants to soften, and now we're kind of breaking through 100 this week. This is a downward draft on the oil markets. The question I would have for you, Trisha, is, as you said there, Jay Powell is a bit of a dove. Do we believe that he's going to tackle inflation? How aggressive, as you say, one or two bites? I mean, he's been, in my opinion, incredibly behind the curve, as you said. How he got reappointed is a mystery. But nonetheless, does this Fed, Powell and his associates, do you think, have the steel to stare down inflation over the next 12, 24 months?
You know, if they're going to tackle inflation, they're going to have to soften the U.S. economy. And that it would soften the global economy. And so they're between a rock and a hard spot. And we do have elections coming up in November. And I mean, I'm not the one saying it, but you can listen to Bloomberg and other sources that this is as a Fed chair who is very politically in tune. And I will say that when he got reappointed, that's when he became a little more hawkish. And he should have been, you know, we should have been having slowly increasing rates last year. They said, if you have month over month inflation, it's a concern. We've had month over month inflation since January of last year. And now we're staring at this 10% inflation levels. So it's very serious. And even with a 50 basis point hike, they're going to have to do that. And they started by saying 25 basis points. And then he came out and did a little speech, sort of a prepared remarks when he was doing an interview. And I think they've thrown out this 50 basis point because they want to get the market comfortable, right? They want to see how it reacts. And of course, the stock market's going to tumble. It will probably, once the market reacts, and they need to just kind of come out with it. We're going to raise rates here. We're going to raise them again. And 50 basis points here, 50 basis points there. If they do that quickly, it's going to help. But they're going to have to act aggressively to actually get a control of this. And I think you actually have Elizabeth Warren was making comments that if the Dems don't get control of inflation, you know, they're going to have problems getting reelected. Well, that's not a news flash, and we all kind of knew this stuff, that the economy matters. And I think that everybody's been really slow because lots of stuff that has happened over the course of this administration is inflationary. I mean, when you expand your budgets and you're writing $1 trillion checks left, right, and center, and you increase the money supply the way we had globally, you know, with during COVID, not just in the US, but what, 27 trillion globally sloshing around the global economy, we're going to have inflation. And you have to respond to that. And the oil market is going to have to.
I mean, this is like a 10-year quantitative easing, right? This is not a 1-year thing. It's been in the Western, certainly, economic structure for a long time now. It's now, can it be abandoned? I mean, there is a certain school of thought out here that says there's no way around this inflation. There's not going to be the stomach to tackle it to the extent that this scale would need. And that 10% inflation, like we live with in various parts of the world, as normal, may become normal in the US. Do you think that's politically digestible there?
No, I don't think it's politically digestible. I think the reality of where we start really feeling inflation has only been for the average. I mean, I've recently used to go to the grocery store and you get 2 small bags of groceries and it's $130. So that's not palatable for the average consumer. And I don't think people in America, because people in America do drive. This is a roughly 10 million barrel gasoline market. So we have not, in my lifetime, or in north of 40 years, and actually, if you look at crude oil prices and inflation, we've not had them high together, and that's really serious. And it's something that we don't have a lot of folks. I think both the Fed doesn't seem to understand it or appreciate it, and the folks in the administrations really are inept on hydrocarbons and understanding how global oil and gas markets work and how serious this is. And so everybody's sort of been behind the curve. And the answer is, yes, you have to produce more. And the problem is we're going to end up sort of producing. We're probably going to be increasing production as the economy is slowing down. And when you talk about that, where oil price is really at, no, the demand, certainly we're okay demand, but we're seeing with IEA and even with OPEC made comments in their last report this month that they're concerned about sovereign debt levels and the global economy as well. But their demand for this year is sort of around 100 million barrels a day, which is roughly where we're at. But it's this reality of that probably $20 to $30 of crude oil prices right now are geopolitically, is this risk, as this fear that, Russian barrels could actually disappear and then they wouldn't be moving, or would lose a couple million barrels a day. But honestly, if we lose a couple million barrels a day and we're and demand's softening a little bit, it's probably going to work out in the wash to a degree. And I think the U.S. is not just the U.S., it's Guyana. I mean, lots of places around the world want to produce crude oil right now at these price levels. And I think I don't know if folks think about it where you're at, but everybody was kind of ixnaying shale and just says we don't have enough inventory left and it just can't do this. Well, I encourage folks to reach out to me or take a look at a rig count map and see where the private operators are drilling, because they're not drilling in the places you thought they'd be drilling before, because oil prices are high and inventory level, the spacing is less relevant now. Acreage that people thought wasn't good before is great now. So, I mean, at these price levels, lots of stuff is up for grabs, not just in the US, but globally. And that's something that folks from an oil market perspective really have to appreciate. And actually, prices being lower is very healthy for the global economy. I mean, we look at where we were at from a global economic growth perspective a few years ago, it was with lower oil prices.
Yeah, and the trend line, of course, does indicate that one shouldn't be shocked to get back to that average oil price where we were over the last 10 years. I just want to wrap up, Trisha, with your thoughts on all things OPEC plus. The major sort of driver of the oil market through COVID, of course, OPEC plus existed pre-COVID, but nonetheless, it really sort of consolidated its position and relevance, managing the world oil markets out or through COVID from the point of view of controlling supply. But that OPEC plus agreement expires in September. It's more or less already kind of redundant in the sense that they're not producing anywhere near their agreement. They meet again next week. It seems like not even worth a headline at this stage. But what are your thoughts on the outlook and the relevance of OPEC plus as they come to the expiry of their agreement? Do they renew? What do they do? What's their purpose, do you think?
Well, I mean, I think OPEC plus isn't getting a fair criticism from folks, given that the plus obviously includes Russia, and that Saudi Arabia has made it very clear that, I mean, Saudi Arabia and the UAE have made it clear they're not going to talk to Biden. They don't care. And it's not fair for Biden to go to the UAE and to Saudi and say increase output, but hey, US shale producers, I'll only call you when I'm desperate. Is a slap in the face to US oil and gas producers. But the OPEC has made it clear that they're not playing ball with the West in many ways. And the fact that they haven't, said much about, I think maybe they said war in one of the reports, and that's probably by accident. They called it conflict in their reports, very similar to sort of China. So I think that their position in this is interesting. Saudi Arabia saying that they're thinking of dominating, or designating crude oil that they're sending to China in Chinese currency and renminbi. That's really significant, actually, to the global oil market from a sort of initial decoupling standpoint, and just from 100 million barrel a day market that we talk about. So
just to drill on that point,
yeah,
just briefly, politically, how does something like that get digested in Washington, given the fact that you are their bodyguard?
Yeah, I don't think they are, truthfully, I do not think they're appreciating it. I think they are so lost when it comes to how hydrocarbons work, because they don't like it so much, that this is not really deeply appreciated. So it's a bigger deal than they need to understand it's a big deal. I haven't heard anyone really talk about it. Even, CEOs and board levels need to start appreciating this, that if a couple million barrels a day is off, you're now dealing with sort of this 98 million barrel a day market from a WTI Brent perspective. So I don't think they're appreciating it. And it will be something that might take a little bit of time. But the fact that they said it, the fact that, Xi Jinping, his first visit out of the country after years of being there, is going to be to Saudi Arabia, it's relatively significant. So, Saudi Arabia and Russia compete with roughly almost 2 million barrels a day each that they're putting into China. And like we were talking about, if China slows down and a bit, they're wanting crude oil, if they slow down the demand a little bit, this is getting a little bit more serious. I think Middle East Economic Survey talked about Iraq having to being being aware that the prices for Russia, I mean, they were competing with discounted barrels. I mean, so you now have OPEC players that are competing with these discounted barrels with Russia. So it's very fascinating right now. I think up until this point, pre-war in Ukraine, they did a really good job from the monthly meeting thing was brilliant because it was really easy for the market to digest it, right? We didn't have these, oh, we wait once a year, we can sort of just have a quick talk, we agreed to do this. And yes, I mean, when you're coming from low base levels of production, they don't have to worry about anything. And they are raising output. I'm more of a bull on Saudi Arabia. I think they're very serious about it, investing in increasing output and increasing output. I think the ability for Saudi Arabia to produce 12 million barrels per day, yes, it takes a little bit of work, but are they going to do it 100%? I'm also bullish on unconventionals in the Middle East. They are there. Getting them out is a little trickier, but I mean, in terms of you find oil where you found oil before. So from a technical standpoint, I'm not worried about OPEC being able to produce it. It's just obviously the
they're certainly investing here quite aggressively in new capacity, and the UAE very much have 5 million barrels as their target and moving towards it. Just final thought, Trisha, all things Iran nuclear talks, are they dead? Are they again in the context of the politics of Washington? Is it a big deal? Is it not? What's it feel like?
I think that they very much wanted them to be, I mean, since the beginning of this administration, I think China, Iran, the US were all sort of hoping that this was going to work. But hardliners in Iran, I think, have made it pretty clear with the bombing of the unbuilt embassy in Iraq, right? They're wanting to do this. I mean, this administration has really wanted to make a deal with Iran because they want that crude oil back on the market. Seems like that crude oil is probably coming back on the market anyway. China's been importing, probably around 1 million barrels per day for a year. So I feel like that Iranian production, and Iran desperately needs that crude oil to help their economy. So I feel like they're going to be adding it. Again, this is in this whole context of this where we're talking about U.S. production growth rising and everybody sort of potentially rising. So I think the talks are dead. Because it seems like if this administration has not been able to get them through to date, this is quite serious. I mean, there are serious hardliners in Iran, the bombings and everything. And yes, some of them want to do this, but others clearly don't. And it just really shows, I think it showcases and catalyzes the political environment within Iran that's very serious. And I mean, that creates a lot of angst and volatility within the Middle East, obviously with Saudi and with Israel. And I think that's extremely complicated. And I think this administration has gotten a lesson in geopolitics that they realize they just can't do everything that they want to do. They haven't changed much geopolitically, from the Trump administration, and they said they would, and they just were able to. And I think this Iran nuclear talks is certainly one of them.
The last administration got the curveball of COVID, this one has got the very large curveball of a war in Europe, which is far from over. And we're going to have to see how that plays out. Trisha, we could talk all day. Trisha Curtis, President CEO of PetroNerds, sitting in beautiful Denver, Colorado, one of my favorite places in the world. Used to love going to Boulder every now and then. I went to college in Indiana, Notre Dame, and so I used to get out to Colorado a bit at that time. And really nice place. Thank you for having us, and we'd hope maybe sometime you'll get out here and join us on a live stage.
I would be honored to do that. I'd love to. And thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, Trisha, all the best. Have a good evening.